get me started crying before I even start talking. You know, I know you're probably getting weary, but we used to have 11 services for Convocation. So we had 6 night services and 5 day services, so you got the light version. But speaking in Convocation is a bucket list thing for me. I've been at Lee longer than anyone else. As Jimmy said, this is my 50th year. So I've been here longer than any other staff member or faculty member. Next after me is Paul Kahn. Next after him is my husband, whom I'm going to talk about in this sermon. So I can remember in that 50 years when it would be unthinkable to have a woman speaking during Convocation. And also, I'm not really a preacher, so I was an unlikely pick on that count as well. But however much of a long shot this was, I'm thrilled to be one of the speakers. And I've been so nervous about the importance of this moment. I love speaking in chapel, and I always take it seriously, but somehow this has freaked me out. So for all my brash desire to do it, once it was a real thing, I was kind of beside myself, as my husband will tell you. But aside from my nervousness over the seriousness of this time, I always knew what I would talk about. I usually fiddle with the topic and change and go back and forth, but this time I knew from the moment I was invited what I was going to talk about. One advantage of having been here so long, and therefore having been alive so long, is that I've had a chance to see the long arc of life. Sometimes we focus on the moment, and we're either elated or horrified because the present reality seems to be permanent. But it takes decades to understand all that it means. So looking at the long arc of life, I actually do have the answer to all your problems and questions, to all your doubts and concerns, and today I am going to give you the secret to a happy life. So here it is, the big answer to everything in the world, to everything in the universe, is love. Since it's almost Valentine's Day, I'll start with the kind of love that's probably most on your mind right now, romantic love. This is my husband. No, that's not my husband. There he is. This is my husband of 48 years. I stole this picture from the Bindagwa. We haven't always been this cute old couple. We met in college at Northern Arizona University. But just a few weeks after we met and started dating, Merle went to Yugoslavia for 2 years to do voluntary service with the International Red Cross. But I was a pretty persistent girl. So after writing to him for a year, I saved all my money and went to Europe to see him the summer I finished my master's degree. We were at a cafe on the little island of Lido in Venice in this picture. It was taken the night he proposed. Isn't that awesome? He was gone for another full year, but when he came back, we were married at my home in Bisbee, Arizona. And who wouldn't marry a man who looked at her like that? And the feeling was mutual. We stick together through thick and thin, and he's quite literally the love of my life. So I'm kind of an expert on long-term relationships. I was teaching at Lee when Merle came home from Yugoslavia, and after he finished his master's degree, he joined me here. A French essayist whose name I can't pronounce said this: "We like someone because we love someone, although." Let that sink in. This saying is similar to 1 Peter 4:8 that says, "Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins." So I am aware that Merle isn't perfect, and that not everyone loves him as blindly as I do. Apparently, some of his students take him a little bit skeptically. And some apparently feel even more strongly. I'm actually quite aware of his faults and failures. I love him, although, and my love for him covers a multitude of, well, sins. Here's how that works. In the interest of time, I will only discuss his major flaws. Although I am available to go into more detail if you want coffee sometime. How many of you have had Merle for anthropology, sociology, benevolence, or global perspectives? Okay. So none of this will come as a surprise to you. Okay, major flaw number 1. I'm going to do this. I've been warning him for the last couple of weeks. Yeah, this could be in the sermon. Okay, major flaw number 1. He's hyperactive and he has undiagnosed attention deficit. This is my evidence for that. He frequently asks me a question and walks away while I'm trying to answer it. So if you're in his class, you know it's not just you. Okay. When we're eating in a restaurant, he sometimes goes to the car while I'm still at the table finishing my meal. It's true. He seldom sits through a whole movie, and before Netflix, I never knew how anything ended. Okay, major flaw number 2. There's only 3. Okay. He doesn't always tell me important things. For example, he's going to Istanbul. I learned this when the students he was taking asked me if I had ever been there. This is an old one, but hint to future wives, never let a good story die. When my daughter was 10 years old, I found out that she was going to Ecuador with Jose Minay. I learned this during a Global Perspectives meeting. We own a boat. I learned this when the marina called to tell me the boat was sinking. That is a totally true story and not embellished for any reason. Okay, number 3, he is generous to a fault. My evidence, the reason we own a boat is that the person who wanted to own it didn't have any money, so Merle bought it for him. Aww. Ugh. I was making a cake when I discovered that he had given my mixer away. I saw a lady with a coat just like mine and realized it was mine. And he accidentally gave our car away. I'll give you the rough outline of that story. He bought a car from a person who also worked at Lee, and he managed to negotiate the price up by 30% because he didn't think the guy was charging us enough. So then we left for the summer, and he loaned this car to someone. We came back, and it turned out that person had loaned it to someone else, who had loaned it to someone else, who had loaned it to someone else, and the trail got cold, and we never got that car back. So he accidentally gave our car away. But here's how he covers that multitude of sins. He brings me fresh coffee in bed every morning before I get up. This is even more significant than it sounds because I sometimes get up at 4. He does his best to make the world safe and pleasant for me. Last week we were in the dining hall when it started to pour down rain. We didn't have an umbrella, so rather than flushing me out into the street, He went back to the humanities building and got an umbrella and came back to the dining hall to pick me up. I just sat there and drank coffee. And although he is technically a pacifist, he defends me with a vehemence that could lead to mortal combat. So as mere mortals in our own strength and by our own will, Christians or non-Christians, we can love romantically in a way that discounts any of our objections. We love someone although. We know that we are capable of that blind, wholehearted love, which is a reflection of God's endless, unconditional love for us. We think we fall into love and we're helpless against it. But here's the newsflash of this sermon. This wholehearted, blind, all-out love that overlooks faults and failures is exactly what God expects us to demonstrate to his children. It's how he loves us, and it's how he expects us to love others. Not just our one true love, but everyone. It has taken me my whole life to reach this understanding. When I was in college, I read Soren Kierkegaard's The Works of Love, in which he said pretty much the same thing, only much more eloquently. I honestly tossed it aside, thinking that can't be right. That would be exhausting. On Sunday, Dr. Kahn talked about God's unending, specific, and particular love for each one of us. Loves that bathes us in his promise and in his purpose. The corollary of that love is our love for others. It isn't a different thing, it's the same thing. God's love for us flows through us to others, and it flows from us in exactly as unquestioning and non-judgmental a way as God's love for us. I'm going to share some of my favorite scriptures that illustrate this point. Jesus was asked, "What is the greatest commandment?" And he answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." Matthew 22:27 through 39. And another one, John 4:7 and 8. We used to sing this one as a scripture song. I love this. I won't sing it, though. "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." This is a revelation about love that may be perfectly obvious to most people, but it has taken me years to be able to see it. The revelation is that we don't have to make ourselves love people. The love for others is already in us as the overflow of God's love for us. A fellow Lee faculty member, who is no longer here, once asked me, "How do you make yourself love students?" I didn't understand, and I asked for clarification. The fact is that I don't make myself love you. I just love you. In my conversation with her, it occurred to me that she had so many objections to students that she was blocking the natural overflow of love for them. This is how I think of that. Several years ago, a Lee student had gone to a local hotel where her parents were staying to get ready for graduation. She pressed her gown and she was looking for a place to hang it up. So she spotted a little silver fixture hanging down from the ceiling. So she hung her robe on that. It looks like this. You know what happened? The weight of her robe pulled that little silver thing out, and water started to pour into the room. First this happened. Then this happened. She flooded the whole room. In fact, she flooded the whole wing of the hotel. Everyone had to move out. All the carpets and furniture on that whole wing were destroyed, along with all the personal possessions of all the hotel guests. Okay, that's not a good story. But I hope you get my point. The water was already there. Someone just needed to dislodge the fixture that kept it from flooding out. This is exactly how the love of God works. The love we have already pours out in unimaginable abundance once we dislodge our objections to the people we fail to love. We have objections to people, and our objections hold back the deluge of love that God intends for us to pour out on them. Maybe the scripture I quoted could lead you to believe that you can pick and choose whom to love, but God's message to us is that we don't have to measure up before He loves us. And other people don't have to meet our standards before we are commanded to love them. Luke 6:27-36 says, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them." If God expects us to love our out-and-out enemies, people who do harm to us, surely He expects us to love people who disagree with us or whose lifestyle or political choices we don't understand, people whose life circumstances are different from ours. And here's the main point. He expects us to be conduits of His love, not His judgment. Judging people isn't our job. Loving them is our job. When He was asked what the greatest commandment was, He didn't tell us that we should judge. He told us that we should love. Before I go on, let me say that you are a much more loving community than Lee students a generation ago. Your generation comes with the natural ability to look past surface details and love people for who they are. As Dr. Kahn's sermon Sunday night pointed out, God looks on the heart, and I think you do too. It's part of the reason I love you and love investing in you. But dream with me for a moment, if you will. What would Lee look like as a community of love if we all just put down our objections to people around us, our judgment of them, and followed God's commandment to love them unconditionally, to love them although? It might shock you to know, as good and open and embracing as you are, that there are people at Lee who hide in plain sight because they're afraid of you, afraid of us. They're afraid that if we knew the truth about them, we would judge them and we wouldn't love them. I have talked with students in hiding hundreds of times over my 50 years at Lee. There used to be a lot more of them when the culture at Lee was more judgmental. But even here, even now, there are students who are afraid that they would experience judgment rather than love if we knew exactly who they are. Dream with me about a Lee University where students from all kinds of backgrounds and situations and beliefs could breathe the air of God's unconditional love. Some students are afraid to tell us that their parents are undocumented. Last semester, we had 2 events for DACA awareness, and 3 young women spoke out for the first time ever about being deferred action childhood arrivals. They had never told their stories before because they were afraid that the people around them would respond with judgment rather than love. and that by talking, they would put their parents in jeopardy of deportation. Your response to them was warm and wonderful, and I am so grateful for your generous embrace of these lovely, hardworking young women. Please pray for them and for the thousands and thousands of other DACAs as they are used as a political football by both parties. Only God can solve this. So please pray for legislation that allows them to live their best lives. Some students of color hide their feelings because they fear being misunderstood or ostracized. They are afraid to say that they have experienced racism. They don't tell us what they've seen and been made to feel. They don't ask us to look at their history and to understand. They are afraid to point out that their different experiences lead them to conclusions that are different from ours. What would it look like if people of color felt loved enough to tell their stories? If we loved enough to listen and to care? What would it feel like at Lee if everyone knew the kind of love that brings about peace and justice? I loved the candlelight vigil at the beginning of the school year. It was a beautiful step toward creating an environment in which students can be honest about their experiences as people of color. And I have loved the way all of you, black and white, leaned into that experience. We all needed that, and we need to keep the conversation going. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. Some students are afraid to tell us that they are gay. They've experienced so much rejection and judgment at the hands of the Christian community that they live in hiding. It is not your responsibility to judge them, but it is your responsibility to love them. In my first year of teaching at Lee, I had an openly gay student in my class. This was in the 1960s, so it was kind of outstanding. He had a huge personality. He was warm and funny and generous and wildly flamboyant. I was so naive and so inexperienced that I jumped on the bandwagon of people who were aghast, and I'm sure he felt my confusion and my rejection. Because he didn't experience any love within the Christian community, he eventually melded into the gay community in Chattanooga. And a few years later, he was a casualty of the great AIDS epidemic. When he died, I knew that I had failed him. God put him in my path for a reason, so that I could engulf him with God's boundless love. I objected to him and held that great love back. My response might not have mattered, but we never know what difference it will make if we do what God asks us to do. I couldn't change what happened to him, but I vowed that I would never again allow my judgment to hold back the love that God intends me to pour out. The AIDS epidemic in the US is mostly behind us, but LGBT students between the ages of 15 and 24 are 6 times more likely to attempt suicide. And those from non-accepting environments are 8 times more likely than other LGBTQ youth. What would it be like if straight students met LGBTQ students where they are, dislodged their objections to them, and let God's love flow over them? James 4:12 says, "There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor?" Some students are afraid to tell us that they're in desperation financially. At the end of last semester, I learned that one of my advisees, whom I dearly love, had been sleeping in her car since September. I was horrified, and my heart broke for her. she was ashamed to tell me that she was in such dire need of help, and that also broke my heart. I want to be the kind of person through whom the love of God flows so freely that no one is ashamed to be their truest self with me. Since I am the grown-up / senior citizen, I may have to say, to quote President Khan, who was supposedly quoting God, "Get off your butt and come to class." But I want my instructive words always to come with a deep well of love for you, and never to be the reason that God doesn't reach you through me. Because it took me so long to come to this understanding, I know many of you won't agree with me. I might not have agreed with me myself at your age. But I hope you will consider my words and the implications of taking the 2 greatest commandments seriously. Jesus has called us to something radical. And at the heart of that radical call is unconditional, non-judgmental love. As I close my career at Lee, my prayer for this institution is that Lee would become a place where loving God and loving our neighbor are truly lived out as the most important commandment. Thank you.